Some people mistake wealth for worth and believe money gives them permission to look down on anyone who serves them. When her daughter married into a millionaire family, she didn't just drift away, she cut her mother off completely, calling her embarrassing for being a waitress. Months later, the daughter's cold-eyed mother-in-law walked into the restaurant with a smirk and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Serve me in my language and I'll give you $100,000. Everyone expected humiliation. Instead, the waitress simply smiled and answered her, not just in flawless Chinese, but in two more languages as the woman stared in shock. What happened afterward revealed who truly had class and who only had money. My name is Odette, I am 57 years old, and I have spent most of my life working double shifts at a small family restaurant. The work is simple: refill cups, carry plates, smile through exhaustion, but it's honest. Tips pay the rent, kindness buys peace, and dignity is a habit she refuses to lose. She knows every regular by voice, every order by heart. Sometimes people look past her uniform as if it erases her story. They don't know she once studied languages before life took a harder turn. Still, she shows up, ties the apron, and serves the world with patience. Wealth never impressed her, respect always did. She thought her daughter understood that too until everything changed. Her daughter began drifting away slowly, like a boat slipping from its anchor. Calls became shorter, visits disappeared. Compliments turned into corrections about clothes, manners, vocabulary. The girl who once sat in the kitchen sharing secrets now spoke as if poverty were contagious. She hinted that success meant leaving the past behind, including the woman who raised her. At first, the distance felt like growing pains. Then it became deliberate silence. She pretended not to notice, answering messages with warmth that wasn't returned. A mother can feel when love is being measured and when she's starting to fail the test. Then came the announcement, a whirlwind engagement to a wealthy businessman from a prestigious family. Photos appeared online: silk gowns, champagne flutes, glittering halls. Her daughter suddenly spoke a new language of brands and social rank. The wedding invitation arrived without warmth, more like a notice. At the ceremony, she sat quietly at the back, invisible among diamonds and polished smiles. No one asked about her life. No one wanted to hear it. Soon after, her daughter stopped visiting entirely, explaining that her new family valued excellence, and waitressing didn't qualify. The door didn't slam, it just closed. The final cut came during a phone call she will never forget. Her daughter said the words calmly, like delivering business news. Wealthy families dislike poverty, and being seen with a waitress could be embarrassing. She suggested keeping distance for everyone's sake. The sentence echoed long after the line went dead. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she finished folding laundry, made tea, and let the silence seep in. Grief arrives quietly when it comes from your own child. She told herself love remains, even when respect leaves, though the lie hurts more each time she repeated it. Word must have spread about the mother who served tables. One afternoon, the elegant mother-in-law arrived at the restaurant with friends, perfume trailing authority. Her eyes scanned the room with the cold curiosity of someone touring a museum exhibit. When she spotted the waitress, a smirk curled at the edges of her lips, the kind that confuses cruelty for humor. She ordered loudly, making sure everyone noticed. Then she leaned back, amused, clearly planning something. Wealth had become a stage, and she was ready for her performance. The waitress simply nodded, pen poised, refusing to shrink. When the meal ended, the woman tapped her glass with a manicured nail and said in a carrying voice, "Serve me in my language and I'll give you $100,000. Laughter rippled through the table. Customers turned, the staff froze. The challenge wasn't about language, it was about power, about reminding the poor waitress of her place. Her daughter looked away, mortified yet silent. The room waited for embarrassment to bloom. Instead, the waitress inhaled slowly, steady as a mountain, and smiled, not with defiance but with quiet confidence that didn't need decoration. Then she answered fluently, gracefully, not only in perfect Chinese but with the respectful tone of someone who understood the culture, not just the words. Gasps fluttered across the room. Before the shock could fade, she switched languages again, then once more, revealing a mind far richer than any wallet. The mother-in-law's amusement shattered into stunned silence. Her daughter's eyes filled not with pride, but with the weight of sudden realization. For the first time, the room saw the truth. The woman in the apron wasn't small. The people who mocked her were. And the balance of power quietly moved across the table and settled firmly in her hands. The restaurant didn't erupt. It breathed in sharply and held the air. Regulars who'd known her for years exchanged proud, knowing glances. Strangers straightened in their seats. Even the cooks peeked through the kitchen window, smiling softly as if a secret had finally stepped into the light. Respect doesn't shout, it simply changes the room. And in that moment, the room changed. Conversations resumed, but the tone had shifted. People weren't laughing at the waitress anymore. They were watching a woman stand inside her quiet power without a trace of arrogance. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply continued taking orders, refilling teacups, and thanking guests the same way she had every day. Only now the world finally saw the grace they had overlooked. The mother-in-law blinked, stunned into rare silence. Wealth had always guaranteed control, restaurants, staff, even conversations bent around her presence. But language is a bridge money can't build. She stared at the waitress, suddenly realizing she had underestimated not just a person, but an entire life she'd never bothered to imagine. The promised $100,000 challenge now sounded childish, like a spoiled child waving coins. She tried to recover her composure, laughing weakly and saying she was only joking, but the joke no longer fit. Power, once so firmly in her hands, slipped like sand between her fingers. And there it was, the truth she'd never faced. Class isn't stitched into clothing or written in bank accounts. It's alive. And she had just failed the lesson spectacularly. Her daughter sat frozen, cheeks burning hotter than any spotlight. She had spent months pretending her mother's life didn't exist, crafting a version of herself that looked acceptable beside luxury. Now that carefully built image cracked. People she admired, staff, family, even strangers, were looking at her differently. Not because of her clothes or marriage, but because of her silence. Because while her mother stood tall under mockery, she had shrunk behind privilege. The embarrassment wasn't about the restaurant anymore. It was about realizing she had abandoned the very woman whose strength she had always relied on. And for the first time, she wondered if wealth had cost her something priceless, her character. When the shock faded, questions began. Guests quietly asked how she had learned so many languages. She explained, gently, that she had once studied translation at university. Life, however, doesn't always walk in straight lines. Illness, job loss, bills, hearts that leave when money does. Education had become a memory, replaced by responsibility. But language had stayed. She practiced with customers, read borrowed books, and spoke to travelers who appreciated being understood. Her fluency wasn't a trick. It was the last unbroken piece of a dream she had refused to let die. She didn't share this to boast, only to remind the room of something simple. The uniform you wear doesn't tell your whole story. Her daughter listened, stunned. She had never asked much about the past, assuming her mother's life had always been small. Now she learned that scholarships, night classes, and endless sacrifice had shaped the woman before her. Her mother had given up completing her degree so her child could attend better schools. Private tutoring, music lessons, travel opportunities. All funded by extra shifts at the restaurant she had been taught to feel ashamed of. The realization cut deep. The poverty she resented had been the very thing that built the future she enjoyed. The world did not shrink her mother. Her mother had chosen to shrink her own dreams so her daughters could grow. Later that evening, while cleaning a quiet corner of the restaurant, she remembered the years when exhaustion became normal. Walking home with aching feet. Counting coins for bus fare. Pretending she wasn't hungry so her daughter could eat more. She never told these stories because love, to her, wasn't a performance, it was simply what you do. Nobody owed her gratitude. But respect, that was different. Respect meant seeing the person behind the service. And today, for the first time in a long time, she felt seen again, not as a prop in someone else's life, but as a woman who had walked through hard seasons and never lost her kindness. Regret settled over her daughter like evening fog, not loud, not dramatic, just inescapable. She replayed every dismissive message, every avoided visit, every time she'd chosen image over love. She had been so busy trying to prove she belonged in her new world that she forgot she already came from strength. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law sat stiffly, realizing that her arrogance had not only humiliated someone undeserving, it had exposed her own insecurity. Wealth protects you from many things, but not from who you are inside. And right now, both women were being forced to look inward, really look, for the first time. Later that night, her daughter finally spoke, really spoke about the pressures inside her new life. Expectations wrapped around every meal, every outfit, every conversation. Perfection wasn't requested. It was required. She learned to laugh when others laughed, even when the humor cut like glass. And slowly, she had begun to mirror the coldness around her, believing kindness made people look weak. That belief had cost her the relationship with the one person who had always loved her without conditions. Tears came not from embarrassment now, but from the realization that she had been shaped by a world that valued money over humanity. And in trying so hard to belong there, she had forgotten where she came from. The truth about the in-laws seeped out slowly, whispered expectations, subtle jokes about status, rules about who was acceptable and who was. They had praised the daughter for marrying upward, while quietly labeling others as less worthy. The mother-in-law hadn't created the prejudice, but she had polished it into tradition. Now, seeing the waitress speak multiple languages with effortless grace shattered the illusion that wealth equaled superiority. It was uncomfortable to realize their worldview had cracks. It was even more uncomfortable to realize those cracks ran through their own character. Respect, they discovered, had never truly existed, only hierarchy. And that realization doesn't leave a person unchanged. Through all of it, the woman at the center stayed steady. She didn't brag. She didn't weaponize her intelligence. She simply returned to work the next day like always, apron tied, hair pinned back, kindness intact. Quiet strength has a way of silencing noise faster than anger ever could. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted dignity restored, hers, yes, but also her daughter's. Because bitterness passes from one generation to the next, and she refused to hand that down. The strongest people aren't loud. They're the ones who keep choosing kindness, not because the world has been kind to them, but because they know how painful the opposite can be. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip ever had, not about scandal, but about pride. Regulars came in just to congratulate her quietly. One elderly couple brought flowers. A young student thanked her for helping him practice Chinese after school. People who had once seen only a waitress now saw a teacher, a survivor, a woman who carried history inside her voice. The restaurant owner raised her wages, not as charity, but as recognition. The community doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply shows up, repeatedly, to remind you that you matter. And for the first time in months, she felt surrounded not by judgment, but by warmth. The incident had peeled back everyone's layers. Some relatives distanced themselves, uncomfortable with humility. Others stepped closer, realizing they had much to learn. Her daughter watched closely, noticing that the people with the least money seemed to show the most heart. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law struggled with a new and unfamiliar emotion: self-reflection. She had built her identity around superiority, yet, faced with undeniable grace, superiority suddenly looked very small. Character isn't revealed when life is easy. It's revealed when we hold power over someone weaker and choose how to use it. And here, the so-called powerful ones had failed. Behind closed doors, the daughter's marriage began to strain. Her husband didn't approve of the public mockery, nor did he approve of the prejudice he had grown up accepting without question. He respected the waitress, admired her composure, and felt ashamed of how his family had treated her. For the first time, he challenged his mother, asking whether money meant anything if it stripped people of kindness. The conversations were tense, raw, and overdue. Love remained, but so did the difference. And the daughter realized that her future depended on whether she chose comfort or conscience. Eventually, the waitress spoke privately with both families. Her voice was calm, not sharp, not angry, just steady with truth. She said respect was no longer optional. She didn't need access to their money, invitations to parties, or approval from anyone. What she needed, and what every human deserves, was dignity. If they wished to remain in her life, they would treat her as an equal. If not, she would release them, without bitterness, but without hesitation. The boundary was clear, and it was drawn not from pride, but from self-worth. And in that moment, the room understood something money had never taught them. Real power is knowing who you are and refusing to shrink. The apology did not happen in a quiet corner where it could be forgotten. It happened at the restaurant, the very place where the humiliation began. The mother-in-law returned, not with friends or bravado, but alone, carrying the weight of her own behavior. She asked to speak, and when granted permission, she apologized publicly, clearly, directly, without the safety net of excuses. She acknowledged her prejudice, the arrogance in her challenge, and the cruelty in mocking someone who served others with grace. Some patrons watched with surprise, others nodded in respect. But the waitress didn't rush to forgive. She simply thanked her for the honesty and said change would be measured over time, not in speeches, but in actions. The daughter's reckoning came slower, and it hurt deeply. She stood across from the woman who raised her and confessed every ugly truth she had avoided. The shame she'd felt about poverty, the fear of not fitting into her husband's world, the way she'd allowed herself to become someone she didn't even like. Tears weren't dramatic, they were quiet and real. She apologized not just for the restaurant incident, but for the years of distancing, the unanswered messages, the silences that cut sharper than words. Her mother listened without interrupting. Then she spoke gently, saying love had never disappeared, but trust had grown fragile like thin glass. If they were to rebuild, it would require patience from both sides. For the first time, the in-laws found themselves on unfamiliar ground, not admired, not envied, simply human. Their wealth no longer shielded them from accountability. Business partners heard about the story. Some quietly praised the waitress. Others questioned the family's values. It was uncomfortable but necessary. The mother-in-law began seeking out people she had once overlooked: staff, drivers, servers, learning their names, their stories, their dreams. Not as a performance, but because she finally realized humanity doesn't live on a financial ladder. It lives in the space where dignity meets compassion. Humility, it turned out, was far harder than luxury and far more transformative. The waitress made something very clear. Money had never tempted her, not the challenge, not the silent offers afterward. She refused every check, every gesture, every attempt to fix the situation with currency. Dignity had no price tag. What she valued was sincerity, growth, and respect that didn't disappear when the world stopped watching. Her daughter finally understood. Real success wasn't measured in net worth, but in how gently you handle the lives around you. And for the first time, the wealthy family found themselves learning, not teaching about value. Conversations at home changed tone. Dinner discussions no longer revolved around acquisitions or status. Instead, they talked about empathy, service, and the unseen lives of those who kept their world functioning smoothly. The daughter began visiting her mother at the restaurant, not to hide in the corner, but to sit proudly at a front table, introducing her to friends as the strongest woman she knew. Slowly, the gap between their worlds shrank. It didn't disappear, but it softened. Mutual respect had finally taken the seat where shame once lived. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some relatives whispered that the family was overreacting. Others believed apologies should be enough without deeper transformation. But relationships built on image struggled under honesty, and some quietly faded away. The ones that remained grew sturdier, grounded in truth rather than appearance. The daughter's marriage hit rough waters, then steadied as both partners committed to unlearning the prejudice they'd inherited. The waitress watched all of this calmly. She had weathered storms before. This time, she simply refused to be the silent casualty of someone else's pride. The real turning point arrived unexpectedly. One evening, the mother-in-law brought a small group of young employees from her company to eat at the restaurant, not to show off, but to teach respect by example. She introduced the waitress not as her daughter-in-law's mother, but as someone who had once sacrificed her own dreams so another woman could chase hers, and still managed to stay kind. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It was genuine. And in that simple moment, the balance shifted for good. No one saw a poor waitress anymore. They saw a woman whose worth had never needed validation, only recognition. You might think the story ends here, but it doesn't. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. The most powerful part is still ahead. She didn't rebuild her life overnight, she rebuilt her boundaries first. Not walls, not distance. Just clear lines shaped gently by self-respect. She welcomed conversation but not cruelty. She accepted apologies but not repeated harm. And she stopped shrinking herself to make others comfortable. At the restaurant, she worked with renewed confidence, speaking when necessary, staying silent when wisdom required it. Her daughter visited often now, willing to sit and listen rather than rush or correct. Even the in-laws knew the rules, kindness first. If it couldn't be offered, space would take its place. Boundaries didn't make her cold. They made her peaceful, and that peace began to echo into every corner of her world. Her daughter didn't demand forgiveness, she earned it inch by inch. She helped with chores. She stayed late after closing to mop floors beside the mother she had once felt ashamed of. She asked questions about the past instead of assuming she already knew the answers. Some days, guilt came back like a tide, and she cried quietly over the choices she'd made. But instead of running from the discomfort, she learned to sit with it. Forgiveness became a journey, not a sentence. And slowly, the sharp edges between them softened. The mother didn't pretend the pain had vanished, but she also didn't hold it like a weapon. Love, after all, had always been there. It had simply been waiting for the truth to catch up. She chose peace deliberately, the way you choose a path on a long walk. Not because anger wasn't justified, but because anger had already taken enough from her life. Peace meant laughing again with regulars. It meant sleeping without replaying conversations. It meant allowing herself to be proud of her resilience, her intelligence, her kindness. She no longer apologized for the life she lived. Instead, she honored it. Every language she spoke felt like a ribbon tying her past dreams to her present strength. And each day, she discovered that dignity doesn't arrive from others, it grows quietly from within. Change didn't sweep through the in-laws like a storm. It arrived slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly. They began greeting staff by name. Tips became generous, but more importantly, gratitude became sincere. The mother-in-law listened more than she spoke. She attended cultural events she once dismissed. And every so often, she returned to the restaurant, not to test, not to display wealth, but to eat a simple meal and ask how things were going. She would never erase the past, but she could choose the shape of the future. And that choice began, quietly, with humility. Life didn't become glamorous, but it became full. Weekends turned into shared meals, stories, and laughter that didn't need permission. Her daughter and son-in-law helped repair things around the apartment. Community members stopped by with warmth, not pity. The restaurant thrived not because of drama, but because kindness attracts people like light. And through it all, she kept learning new recipes, new phrases, new ways to stay hopeful. The world that once felt divided between wealthy and poor now looked different. There were only people, some learning, some stumbling, all capable of better. The future didn't roar. It whispered. Soft mornings. Quiet tea. Occasional travel she once thought she'd never afford. She and her daughter found new traditions, walks after work, small handwritten notes, long conversations in whichever language suited the mood. They didn't avoid the past. They simply refused to live inside it. And little by little, the hurt that once defined them shrank into a lesson instead of a wound. Looking back, she realized the world often misunderstands value. People praise money because it shines, but true worth is felt, not counted. It lives in the way you treat the person pouring your tea. It lives in the strength to stand tall without stepping on anyone else. Her story had never been about languages, or a challenge, or even a public apology. It was about dignity, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause. She touched her worn apron, smiled softly, and whispered a truth she now carried with certainty: respect is the greatest currency. And the people who truly have it never need to prove it.